Now we turn our focus to the effects of the meltdown. Here's a lineup of some of the world's most influential voices sharing what they learned from those events.
It showed that the liquidity problem was the most important one, and if the funding disappears, that could happen to other institutions as well. And then you realized how interconnected we were in the financial system.
I think we all learned that things are much more interconnected and complicated than we could imagine. And I think we all also learned that we have to really monitor what's going on in financial markets much more than perhaps some thought earlier. One major legacy of the crisis is that people now understand the importance of having a sound financial system in macroprudential regulation. You can't just regulate individual institutions and have stable prices and think everything will be okay.
Clearly, banks had invested in things they didn't understand. Banks had too little equity. Regulators had retreated too much from regulation at the end or at the peak of a very heavy phase of deregulation. Supervisors have underestimated very important components of risk, in particular elements of interconnectedness.
It's absolutely correct that we didn't understand completely the interconnectedness, and I think there's a much better understanding today. I think banks are much safer and sounder, but to say we understand all the complexity of the interconnectedness would probably be a bit optimistic.
The economy would have ground to a halt. We could have gone back to a repetition of the Great Depression of the 1930s. Now, I think we would have taken action, as we did take in late 2008 and early 2009, to try to offset the consequences of that, but we wouldn't have prevented it altogether.
These video sequences we've put together, I think, have been phenomenal. I hope you've really enjoyed them. Our team killed themselves to get some of the moments and the insights here looking back 10 years. There is no one, and I mean no one, who can synthesize the Lehman moment and the direct Lehman moment like Brad Hintz, legendary at Sanford Bernstein, maker of black books on banking. Mr. Hintz, for 3 years, was CFO at Lehman Brothers and has moved on to New York University, where he teaches cherubs what not to do in the next crisis. Nobody's talking about Lehman. We're talking about the moment. It's this fiction from 10 years ago. You did not live it at that moment. You were there before. Give us a window into the Lehman distinction with Richard Fuld. What made Lehman different at that time? I think we have an understanding of the Bear Stearns distinction, but Lehman's a mystery. What was Lehman like in 05, 06, 07, and on to the crisis?
Oh, remember, Lehman was one of the major players in the mortgage market.
You wanted to work there.
Well, of course.
No, I mean, everyone wanted to work there.
Right,
it was
exactly.
prestigious.
In my case, I was treasurer of Morgan Stanley, and I could become the CFO of Lehman. It seemed like a wonderful, wonderful move. The issue was Lehman was this marvelous mortgage machine. Now, it was also a fixed income power around the world, right? Now, we know that one of the issues with fixed income is it's not liquid, right? The market is inherently not liquid, which means the market makers have to provide the capital. So Lehman was more leveraged than the rest. Lehman relied on a lot of short-term funding. And by the way, the rest of the street believed that repo, or the secured financing, was rock solid, would never, never go away. And of course, when the fire started in mortgages, it spread elsewhere. Well, what are the firms that you're going to hit first?
Right.
You're going to hit the mortgage players, and those were Bear and Lehman. In the case of, as we were getting to the end there, Lehman made the bet in 2007. Remember, the crisis sort of...
What was the bet they made?
They made a bet that this liquidity event, the mortgage market falling, was an opportunity. And you actually see, if you track, that their balance sheet rises through the beginning of 2008. Exactly. By the way, that would work 9 times out of 10 in a liquidity event. If you have enough liquidity, you could you could live through it. You'd make money.
Okay.
They didn't.
But this is important. The fancy guys like you escaped the wrath. Mr. Fuld, I saw, I think, 10 days before the collapse. He was exhausted, yes. But you know what? Life went on. The image we have are those backs against the glass wall as they told the kids goodbye. And then we had the idea of the kids walking out with one cardboard box. I mean, that's the video media images we have today. Are those kids going to walk out of a bank again like that? Are we going to move on to another Lehman where the fancy people move on, but the kids can't? They're destroyed?
Well, I don't think the kids were destroyed. You know, Lehman was a wonderful place to work. In terms of the front office people, you know, if you go to LinkedIn, you'll find, you know, this Lehman group of alumni are just loyal as can be, even to today.
Yes, I noticed that.
The issue with Lehman was that I landed in Milan on the Monday that Lehman filed for bankruptcy. I was going on a marketing tour. Now, I knew Lehman was in trouble. That was the subject on everybody's lips, and I was hitting the European markets. While I was in the air, it became clear that Lehman, I landed. Bernstein set up an 1,100 client conference call. Mm-hmm. Now, remember, the rest of the street is burning, so none of the equity analysts could talk. Save me, which was a wonderful thing to work at Bernstein at that moment. So I'm on the call. What was the message that came from all of those 1,100 clients? It was huge fear. Why did the Fed allow it to go? So there was amazement, there was fear, there was disbelief, and who held Lehman exposure was the question. And that explains what happened.
Posner, Bernanke, were they wrong?
Terribly wrong.
Should they have come in like Bear Stearns?
They didn't have to save the Lehman equity holders, but they needed to make it less of a crisis, because if I don't know whether you had Lehman exposure, am I going to lend you money? No. Mm-hmm. And it was that uncertainty that caused everybody to pull in. They pulled in their financing, and it led to the crisis that occurred later. You know, we have a recent book that came out, and the book was by Professor Ball, who makes the argument that the Fed had the power to save Lehman. But whether they had the power or not is not really the issue. The issue is, should they have? And they should have. They would have made it a much softer crisis. Mm-hmm. You didn't have to save the people. You didn't have to save.
Let's bring in my colleague Anna Edwards in London. Anna?
And Brad, I know you spent, good morning to you, I know you spent a lot of time thinking about why you and others didn't necessarily see exactly what was coming at the time. You mentioned how the market seized up because nobody knew who held what. Do you think now when you look at the market, we have any firewalls in place to prevent something similar from happening? The activities around living wills for banks to enable things to be wound up if they're systemically important. Has any of that really made a difference to if we had another Lehman to contend with?
Well, yes, absolutely. The regulators are in a much better position in terms of understanding the linkages between the banks. They had no information on this at the time in 2008. So the banks they have a bigger liquidity reserve. Their capital ratios are much higher. Leverage is down. The size of their trading books are down. The risk taking is down. These are all very good things. Doesn't exactly solve a tail event. But it certainly says that we're better prepared than we were at that time.
So we're better prepared. So we're better prepared from a regulatory perspective, Brad. And what about in terms of the minds of analysts and market participants and the dangers of groupthink? Has everybody been forced to learn the lessons and the dangers of groupthink? Because that is in part what got people into this situation. No, the dangers of groupthink still exist. My worst piece of research was August 2007, when BNP said that they could not mark the value of their two mutual funds. I did a marvelous quantitative analysis that said the average crisis was 2.2 quarters long. Right. The street would drop by 40%. It was wrong.
Brad, this is so important. We have to bring it up, and I've reached this with Henry Kaufman, the great Henry Kaufman, before. Nobody talks about the Lehman board. Do you hold them at fault? Did they not provide the leadership and governance to an exhausted Richard Fuld at the time?
I think what you have to do is look at Lehman as a Greek tragedy. Remember, Lehman was spun off by American Express in 1994 because American Express could not sell it. Fold took over. And if one were to look at Lehman 1994 to Lehman 2006, you'd put Fold on the cover of Businessweek. I mean, he took the firm from a teetering, sort of one-horse firm, turned it into a global power. Now, it was all taken away from him. So were there mistakes? Yes, absolutely. Lehman's management tended to love short-term funding, and that's dangerous. And Lehman relied on a couple of businesses too much, which was they allowed mortgages to be too much. Was the board guilty? I don't think the board was any more than other financial services boards.
Anna?
And Brad, that short-term funding, that was one of the reasons that Northern Rock, it was a very different business model, obviously, but short-term funding and reliance on those markets was also something that that ended Northern Rock's life, if you like, here in the UK. Has that gone away? Do we need more regulation around that, or is that not part of the story anymore? Do you see too much groupthink around that still?
No, that has been improved. If you look at the funding base of the G-SIBs, the largest banks, they have much more deposits, much more core funding. In other words, long-term debt than what they had before. Now, there still is short-term funding. I think what we've learned is that repo is not stable. We've also learned that repo counterparties have to be willing to take risk. The KISS can't take money market funds and put them into repo and say that they're willing to take risk of a counterparty. I mean, that was one of the problems. The analogy that I use in my class is that typical repo counterparties were zebras, and what the street was doing was taking horses and painting stripes on them and pretending they were zebras.
That's great. You use that in the class?
Yes.
Maybe I think I should sign up. Brad Hintz with us of New York University. That was extraordinary. And on American banking, you just talked to Brad Hintz of New York University with his career at Lehman, his career at Sanford Bernstein. We're going to see the consolidation Dr. Posen is talking about.
It's very difficult. Everybody wants.
Why?
Everyone wants a national leader. So we've got Deutsche, and Deutsche is in a desperate situation. The retail business in Germany is not a high margin business, unlike the U.S. banks, right? This would be one where, because you're competing with Landesbanks, it's very, very difficult for them to make money on that. They're too reliant on the capital markets business. Inside the capital markets business, they're too fixed income oriented. They still have a very profitable trade finance business. They're good in capital markets in certain parts of the world, but this is a management team that's tried almost every trick in the book, and really their only choice is sort of continue to shrink.
And Brad, I hear a lot of people calling for consolidation of the banking sector, but I spoke this morning to somebody with a different view, Professor Skidelsky, a professor here in the United Kingdom, who, of course, famous biographer of Keynes, but he talked about how the banking system 10 years after Lehman would be safer if actually banks were smaller, and he was not calling for further consolidation. Is there another view against that groupthink that says we need to have consolidation and bigger banks in Europe?
No.
Say no.
You could make an argument in the world of capital markets that if the pricing were different, you could have a lot of small capital markets, and then risk takers could take risk and they could blow up and it would not have an impact. We're past that. That's a long time ago. We're not going to go back to that. In the banking world, scale remains the issue. A lot of these banks, they're just too large. There's just no reason for all the brick and mortar that exists in the banking world. I don't think until the Europeans become Europeans, rather than having their national champions, we're going to have a consolidation across the country. So we will have some consolidation within, but it remains a problem. The European banks, the large ones, none of them are beating their cost of capital. We're 10 years after Lehman. That's a long time. U.S. banks are barely beating it. But so no one in the sector is really doing brilliantly. But the U.S. banks are really well ahead in terms of their performance.
3 European banks. I showed this in the earlier hour: BNP Paribas, Deutsche Bank, UniCredit, and there's a blue line going up. That would be Fortress Diamond with us, Brad Hintz of New York University. And of course, if the blue line goes up, you should run for president. Have you ever heard of a banker being asked to run for president, and the Washington Post op-editing that, Jamie run Jamie and that kind of thing? President Diamond?
Would he be a good president? Yeah, but he's a wonderful leader. Think of all what he's done. On the other hand, you're talking to somebody who wanted Bill Bradley to run. So I think the issue that Jamie's going to run into is he's recognizable in a tri-state area. Everyone knows what
Does he play
done.
west of the Hudson River?
Peoria, Bloomington, yes, those are real issues. And then recognize no one likes rich bankers. I mean, you can be the most pleasant person on earth, and if you're a banker, you're not popular. So he's got his industry that is not going to be good. I can already write the opposition's attack on a banker running for president. So I think that's a tough one.
Anna?
But I guess, Brad, you could have written those oppositions if you'd been asked, should a guy who made his money in real estate, got rich through real estate, you could have written those too. I mean, he's sort of reset the rules, hasn't he? But I suppose there's one thing. They both would be wealthy gentlemen, which perhaps is what it takes.
Fair enough. Yeah, you could spend your own money on that one.
You talk about west of the Hudson River, and of course we all know, Brad Hintz, of your loyalty and allegiance to Purdue. They start out 2 football losses in a row. It's crisis. I know you're on the short list. If they lose if they lose to Missouri this weekend, you could be the new football coach for Purdue. But
I'm hoping for that.
You're hoping for that.
Yes,
but seriously, in West Lafayette, Indiana, can Jamie Dimon play? I just don't buy it. How can an industrialist from zip code Manhattan play out in Indiana?
Well, that's a very good point. I mean, you saw, yesterday
right.
with Bernanke and Paulson, they're justifying the banks because they know they saved the economy.
Right.
The market thinks, or the populace thinks that they saved Wall Street, and there's the fundamental problem. I mean, what does a banker do? We all know that they do good things for the economy.
Right. American corporations whose heads are spinning. They can be the visible large caps, they can be the mid caps, even small cap multinationals. What would you suggest they will respond? How will they respond to this politics?
Well, through the Business Roundtable, you're going to have pressure on saying, what are you doing? On the other hand, is this simply political theater? Is he trying to scare a somewhat better deal than what he has now? He's unpredictable. And, in the case of this, it throws for all the large corporations their long-term planning in the trash can, because, everything is done on a global basis. You're sourcing things on a global basis. You're doing your taxes on a global basis. And you start throwing tariffs into it, your optimality changes. And there's the fundamental problem.
And this is interesting, Brad. You raised the question of what's material and what is for political theatre, because I wonder, as we look at the closest we've got to resolution of any trade conflict is with Mexico, and other voices smarter than mine have made the point that actually the difference between the pre and the post NAFTA deal that Mexico is tempted to sign is not actually that great, and yet he will sell it in a very different way. Is that really at the heart of what we're talking about here?
Well, yes, but boy, I do not want to put myself in the position of being able to read President Trump's mind. That's, we need someone other than me on that one.
Good news, got a promotion and a damn good raise.